All right. I'm going to call this meeting of the Polk County Board of Commissioners to order for Wednesday, March 13th, 2004. All commissioners are present. Announcements are on the agendas. Extra copies are in the back of the room. First item up is for comments for items that are not on this agenda. Okay, next up is approval of agenda.
Move. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passes unanimously. Approval of minutes from March 6th.
Move approval.
Second that.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passed unanimously. Approval of consent calendar.
Also move.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, next up is a public hearing on legislative amendment 23-03. Who's leading us off?
That'll be me. Good morning. My name is Michael Burns and I'm an associate planner for Polk County's Community Development Department. I'm here to talk about planning file LA 2303, which is a legislative amendment proposal to update the text of Polk County zoning ordinance, chapter 136 and 177, which pertain to the exclusive farm use and timber conservation zoning districts. During this presentation, I'll first provide some background information about the text amendments. Then I'll go over the applicable review and decision criteria. Next, I'll discuss the optional changes recommended by staff and the Planning Commission for the Board of Commissioners to adopt. Lastly, I'll discuss the staff and Planning Commission's final recommendation. So a little background, Oregon Revised Statute 197.646 states that when new land use statutes, statewide planning goals, or rules implementing statutes or goals are enacted, that counties must either adopt amendments to their local code or implement the changes to state law directly for certain land use applications. Currently, the Planning Division applies state statute directly for certain applications. Many of the proposed amendments are required to be adopted by Polk County in order to be in conformance with state law or they're not substantive changes. However, this presentation will focus primarily on the optional amendments. All the proposed changes to chapter 136 and 177 of the Polk County zoning ordinance can be found in attachments A and B of the memorandum and staff report, which was provided to the Board of Commissioners and made available on the county's website. A public hearing with the Planning Commission was held on February 6, 2024, where staff made them a recommendation. The Planning Commission concurred with the proposed amendments and recommends those changes to the Board of Commissioners. So the applicable criteria for legislative amendments can be found in Polk County Zoning Ordinance, Chapter 115, Section 060, which requires legislative text amendments to comply with the state statutes, planning goals, and administrative rules, conform with the county's comprehensive plan, be in the public interest and general public benefit, and also comply with all applicable intergovernmental agreements. All applicable notice requirements were met pursuant to Chapter 111 of the Polk County Zoning Ordinance. On March 5th, 2024, staff provided the Board of Commissioners memo and staff report demonstrating compliance with these criteria. And notice of tonight's public hearing was published in the Itemizer Observer newspaper on February 21st, 2024. All supporting documents were made available on the Polk County's planning website as well. So first, we'll go over the optional changes to Chapter 136, which pertains to the exclusive farm use zoning district. So the first proposed text amendment that's optional is to replacement dwellings. For the most part, the text amendments would provide parity between state law and the Polk County zoning ordinance. However, staff and the Planning Commission recommends not adopting a certain section that was passed in the changes to state law which has to do with the statewide fire risk map. According to the requirements in ORS 215.291 2BC, replacement dwellings must comply with the provisions of R327 of the Oregon Residential Specialty Code if located in an extreme or high wildfire risk area on the statewide wildfire risk map, or if such a map has not been adopted. As of yet, that map has not been adopted and has also been kind of tweaked since this change in state law was passed. So the categories for wildfire risk have changed. So the proposed text amendments recommended by staff and the Planning Commission would not adopt this section and instead would apply this section directly in case it would change in the future, and would make it, we would make meeting this a condition of approval, where the applicant would be able to, at the time of building, see if a map has been adopted, and then if it has been adopted, if the dwelling would be in one of the areas that requires this section to be applicable.
Let me provide some clarity to this too. So simply what the Planning Commission has recommended is that we just apply the statute directly. And the rationale that the Planning Commission had for that is that the statute references a map that's been rejected by the Oregon legislature, and they've asked for a new map to be developed. You've seen this new map at the AOC district conference, where the Oregon Department of Forestry and Oregon State University presented that to the counties in our district. And Polk County did not have any hazard areas. So there isn't a concern that we're going to have a wildfire risk hazard area. So the impetus of pulling it into our code when we're certain that we're not going to have a high risk area, and two, that the statute probably needs to be amended because it's referencing a map that has a completely different name and completely different risk categories. And we felt that, and the Planning Commission concurred, that if we apply the statute directly, we essentially will apply it in an application. And we will make sure that we have a condition of approval that requires the property owner to ensure that they have determined whether at the time that they come in, whether the map's been adopted or not, and whether they're in a wildfire area. And if so, they have to submit building plans that comply with that section of the building code. So it's not that we're proposing that we ignore this, but we don't want to have to come back again and change it again when there's really very little risk that we would end up with a high wildfire risk area. And that's the background sort of behind that recommendation. I just want to be clear that we're not saying that we wouldn't apply it, that we're obligated to apply that statute. We just wouldn't be pulling it into our local code. We'd continue to do it the way that we're doing it now.
And obviously you're prepared to answer questions from applicants towards those ends.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, the other amendment to chapter 136 would be related to temporary medical hardship dwellings. So as a part of a previous legislative amendment, LA 2302, hardship dwellings were made to be a conditional use in the exclusive farm use zone. The proposed text amendment here would make it clear that hardship dwellings now being conditional uses would not be subject to the public hearing requirements pursuant to Polk County zoning ordinance chapter 182.040B, which has to do with deer and elk habitat being a conflicting use, or with conditional uses in the deer and elk habitat requiring a public hearing. It's clear that at the time that this was adopted, hardships weren't a conditional use and therefore weren't intended to be subject to this standard.
I can provide, I think, some good background on this as well. So the way that our goal 5 conformance works is if you're in a deer and elk winter range, if you are a conditional use, it requires a public hearing in order to establish that conditional use. So rather than the planning director being able to render a decision on a conditional use, it has to go to the hearings officer. At the time that we structured our code and our goal 5 compliance, we didn't want to call hardship dwellings, temporary hardship dwellings, conditional uses. but we still needed to be able to conform with the statutory requirements. And so what we did at that time is we took the ORS 215-296 conditional use criteria, so the criteria for conditional uses in state statute, and we plugged it in as criteria for a temporary hardship dwelling. And then we made it clear that temporary hardship dwellings aren't required to our own local standard for how we do deer and elk. What's happened is that we found that because we're not treating the temporary hardship dwelling as a conditional use, we're not sending a pre-notice out to surrounding property owners for them to be able to comment on the temporary hardship dwelling before we issue a decision. And their only recourse if they have issues that they may want resolved is to appeal that to the Board of Commissioners or the hearings officer. And so we felt that it was in the interest of the county to call a hardship dwelling a conditional use permit. And we've done that so that we provide our conditional use notice requirements. And we've moved that criteria for conditional uses out of the temporary hardship dwelling standards. And we send them to our chapter 119 that has those exact same standards located in it. And we want to make clear that the intent of the county when we adopted our deer and elk winter range habitat criteria that requires the hearing, when we didn't intend that to include a temporary hardship, that we still don't intend for that to include a temporary hardship. And that's really what Michael's trying to clarify here with the way that we've crafted the code and the way that the Planning Commission is recommending it to this board. Does that make sense? Yes.
Moving on to chapter 177 updates, which pertains to the timber conservation zone. This would have the exact same updates to the replacement dwellings and hardships that we talked about. It would also, for the hardships, it would make it clear, or rather, it would move it to a conditional use similar to the update that was done earlier this year as a part of LA 2302 to make the conditional use, and then have the same deer and elk clarification about the public hearings. For home occupation, state law allows home occupations to be operated by a resident or an employee of the resident of the subject property. And so the proposed change would adopt the language directly from state law, which would make it clear that it can be a employee of the resident of the property rather than just a resident of the property. So for that reason, the current code is more restrictive than state law slightly.
Repeat that.
So currently the Polk County code says that home occupation can be occupied by a resident of the property, but in state law it says it can be occupied or it can be operated by a employee or a resident. And so that's slightly more restrictive because there's a limit to the number of employees that there could be. And so if the resident has to count toward that, it would be one less person.
5. You can have up to five employees, and if the property owner isn't part of it, it could have an impact. This is simply a legislative change that the legislature added. Somebody lobbied and got the legislature to change that section of the code. And because it's what we call a sub 2 use in ORS 215, it's at the discretion of counties as to whether or not on a sub 2 use, they want to be more restrictive than state law. And so this was one of those instances where we have the old language, which happens to be more restrictive than the new language. And so the question is, do you want to incorporate the new language into our local code? In this instance, we have the ability to be more restrictive. And the Planning Commission recommended that we do.
Okay. And then the last optional change would be for land divisions. So currently the Polk County zoning ordinance requires land divisions to be filed within 2 years of approval. However, this requirement is not found in state law. And so the Planning Commission and staff recommends removing this requirement, essentially to allow property owners longer time to exercise their approved land divisions.
No cap?
In urban growth boundaries, there's still a cap, I believe, of 10 years. That's in state law, but there's no cap in state law for land divisions other than that.
So how does it get, curiosity, let's say that there's an action taking place or somebody starts a process, but never finishes it. How does it get cleaned up if in a sale, for example, if heirs of an owner, heirs of somebody decided to sell it, then
This is how much time you have to record the plat.
Yeah.
That's simply it. And so right now we give you 2 years to record the plat. If you don't record the plat within 2 years, you haven't exercised your land use approval and you got to come back and pay again and start all over.
Mhm.
State law doesn't put that restriction. If you never recorded a plat, the plat doesn't exist. The state doesn't put a timeline from when you have local approval to do a partition to when you have to actually record the plat. And so you could come back, with the exception of urban growth boundaries, it's a 10-year limit. You can't, after 10 years, you can't come back. So you could set any standard that you wanted for that. The Oregon legislature didn't impose, and knowingly, because they have a standard in UGBs, they specifically don't put a restriction outside of urban growth boundaries on it. And we don't know why. We had a 2-year restriction. And so we raised that issue with the planning commission, and they also said, we don't know why we have a 2-year restriction. We recommend removing it. But you could put any timeline you wanted on that. And if you did choose that you wanted to put a timeline, I would, for sake of consistency, that you just follow what's done in urban growth boundaries and we just treat them all the same. But that would be my recommendation if you did in fact feel that you wanted to put some type of a cap on it.
so desperately want to ask another professional in the room a question specific to this, but I don't want to put her on the spot. Are you willing?
Sure, I may not have the answer.
Do you have any challenges with this
The time limit?
or no time limit?
It's just in the ether until it gets recorded. It doesn't impact the tax assessor until they actually create the unit of land, right? When they record the plat, the unit of land is created. Until that time, it's still just what it's always been. They just have the local approval from the county government to be able to do the partition, right? And so it doesn't really, nothing happens until the plat gets recorded. And if the plat gets recorded, it's exercised. So it's really just this duration of time. And I don't believe it impacts the county surveyor's office, the assessor's office, or the clerk's office. It's just a matter of, does it go, do you think it goes stale after a certain amount of time, or not? And the Oregon legislature doesn't believe it does.
I just find it curious that we had a standard. We had a 2-year time limit, and we don't know why we have a 2-year time limit. There was a reason, apparently, at the time for that. I'm just curious about what would that have been, and what are we disrupting by changing this? Not against it. I'm curious about.
We've got a long institutional memory in the department. I've been there for over 24 years now. And so I can't tell you from a practical standpoint what benefit it brings other than some certainty that something would be exercised in a certain amount of time. If something was recorded or if we approved something and nobody did anything with it for 15 years and they come back and record it, it could be a surprise to people that didn't do their due diligence and come and look and see what kind of planning authorizations were sitting there without timelines. So in terms of providing certainty in the community, it probably provided some certainty that if you didn't come back and record it within 2 years, you'd have to start all over again. And if you have, different issues in your community, you'd have to address those at the time that you come back. But this is, I don't know of an issue where, other than that, where there would be a benefit.
The partition standards probably wouldn't change over time,
It's minimum parcel sizes, right? And so if this is in our resource zones and the Oregon legislature sets the minimum parcel sizes and the Oregon legislature sets the timeline for how much time you have, and they didn't set a timeline outside of UGBs. And they did set a timeline inside UGBs. So it's not like the legislature is unaware of this issue. And so we just made that apparent to the planning commission, and the planning commission felt it should be removed. I could make an argument either way. And I can support this board with findings any way the board wants to handle it. And we can always come back and we can add it later.
Yeah. It's just anytime that we're changing it, it's relaxing. It's interesting. How did we get here to where we are? And then it probably does make sense to do it, I think, to make this change. I have no arguments with it. Anyway.
Okay. Lastly, The proposed text amendments would add provisions to chapter 177 for two new things. So the first would be a land division to preserve open space or a park. This is a new set of criteria under which land division may be approved. The county may choose to adopt this standard or can choose not to. And then finally is a new single-family accessory dwelling to support family forestry. This is a new kind of dwelling, which once again, the county can choose to adopt or not adopt. This dwelling would allow for a secondary dwelling on a property zoned TC. It would have to be occupied by an owner or relative of the owner of the property, and they would have to assist with forestry operations.
This is where the Oregon legislature is providing parity to the exclusive farm use zone in the timber conservation zone. The exclusive farm use zone has a family farm help dwelling provision, and they've mirrored that now in the timber conservation zone and made that available for local governments to adopt.
What are there acreage criteria here?
No. This is Wild West. I'm sure that there'll be case law that'll come in that'll put sidebars just like on family farm help dwellings. But right now it's a pretty broad and we have a bit of local discretion. But with any new legislative change, what'll end up happening is we'll end up getting more clarity as the courts adjudicate issues that rise in different counties and provide more guidance on how to interpret the statute.
I find it interesting. I need to learn more about this exactly, but I find it interesting that, I mean, you're saying it's Wild West. I kind of know what that means. And yet we have these wildfire hazard maps hanging out there that are undetermined. And the whole purpose in that process with Senate Bill 762 and subsequent bills is to try and make certain that we protect people from burning themselves up. And we're going to add more homes.
What's important here is that we don't have any high hazard areas. On the map.
I'm talking in generalities across the state here.
They leave it as an option. So the Oregon legislature isn't mandating that we adopt the accessory dwelling unit for forestry. So if we did have high hazard areas in the county, we could choose not to adopt it, or we could impose conditions that require that they're limited where we have high hazard areas. And typically, I think with forest zones, it's the first dwelling that really brings the significant risk of wildfire, right? Mm-hmm. It's that first dwelling. And then it's really about protecting structures and the risk to structures sort of after that. So, I mean, that whole thing is kind of complicated, but we, you know, from the staff's perspective, we're not concerned that we're going to have high hazard risk areas. And because of that, we felt very comfortable recommending to the Planning Commission that this be included. And we didn't have any other specific additional conditions that we felt really should be imposed in order to address that. Simply because we happen to be in, you know, the Western Valley and have a lower risk of fire. And it would be awkward if the primary dwelling doesn't have to meet any of the standards, but the accessory dwelling does. And the Oregon legislature has done that in other instances where the primary doesn't have to meet any of these things, but the second one has to meet them. And I think it's simply because that when they created the new regulations for that additional use, it just happened to be when there's also these legislative concerns about wildfire. And so it was convenient to impose those standards, but they didn't go back and retro the other ways to get dwellings to apply those standards. So there's all kinds of awkwardness with the statute. And with this particular instance, we don't have to do it if we don't want to do it. We can do it and we can impose conditions to be more restrictive if we choose, or we could bring it in verbatim. We just can't be less restrictive than state law. And there's one other thing I want to touch on that I think is important that the board understands what is coming from this recommendation in terms of the literal application of statutory language. And that has to do with replacement dwellings. And the replacement dwelling language in the statute says that the temporary hardship manufactured structure has to be removed at the end of the hardship. And what's important to note is that you can use a modular structure or manufactured structure for lawful permitted uses in the exclusive farm use and timber conservation zone. So if I want an accessory, farm office, I could use a manufactured structure or a modular structure for that under the building codes. And as long as that use is permitted and lawful, I could use it for that. And so there's this, if we use the language of the statute verbatim, it would imply that at the end of the temporary hardship, if I wanted to repurpose that manufactured structure in a lawful manner for a lawful use, I would still have to literally remove it for a second and bring it back on, which we felt from a practicing standpoint created an undue hardship for our citizens, and that by not using that specific language, we don't contravene the purpose of the statute. You would still have to get a change of use permit. You would still have to be using it for a permitted use as though it was not there in the first place. And so for that reason, we were comfortable to kind of tweak that language just a little bit, because we didn't think that the legislature necessarily intended to create that pain point for somebody's family that was suffering a medical hardship. And we felt that the language that we use in no way contravenes the intent and purpose. And so I just wanted to make that clear too, that there's that with that, we've really talked about, I think, all of the little oddities in this legislative amendment.
Okay. So to recap, staff and the Planning Commission recommend that the Board of Commissioners adopt all mandatory changes to Polk County zoning ordinance, chapter 136 and 177 found in attachments A and B. Staff and the Planning Commission recommend that the Board of Commissioners discuss the optional changes listed in attachment A and B of the staff report. And for each of these changes, staff and the Planning Commission recommend that the Board of Commissioners determine if the provision should be adopted, and if so, what the language should be. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so in the format of a public hearing, I'm first looking for, do we have anybody that you know of that wanted to speak to this?
No, I think that you have the declarations, LUBA declarations, ex parte declarations. Morgan, you want to walk me through that real quick?
Yeah, that should be in your instructions for the public hearing, which I believe are on the back of your agendas there. But if anyone has had any ex parte contact regarding these matters, this will be your opportunity to declare it prior to opening the hearing. And then a reminder to anyone in the audience that is presenting, anything you do present, you need to present at a hearing or through written testimony prior to the hearing in order to preserve that argument for a LUBA appeal.
And you must address the applicable review and decision criteria in order to preserve that with the Land Use Board of Appeals on an appeal. That way you afford the decision body an opportunity to address that issue prior to appeal.
A lot of words there.
You've received no written or email concerns from folks. Okay.
Because it's super complicated.
Yes, it is.
This is a public testimony period. So checking again. All right. Doesn't sound like there's any public testimony. We don't have an applicant. Questions for the board? I could ask questions all day long on this and still never be completely satisfied, I'm sure.
There's really a lot. Acre limitations or none. Really amazes me. Limitations applied for so many others for adding replacement dwellings or dwellings. And this has no acreage requirements whatsoever.
So acreage is independent from whether or not you have a lawful permitted use. So if you have a single family dwelling, you could have a single family dwelling on a parcel that was created lawfully prior to the enaction of minimum parcel sizes at the state. So those 80-acre sizes really didn't happen until after House Bill 3661 in 1993. Right. And so before that, we did have, we had to show how we were consistent with the goals with our minimum parcel sizes, but you could have variation. And then even prior to, 1976, we really didn't even have, standards, a lot of standards for minimum parcel sizes. So if you had a pre-existing dwelling, you have a bundle of rights that comes with that lawful dwelling to be able to do ancillary uses in the zone, like a home business or an accessory family farm help or an accessory, in this case, forest help or a temporary hardship. And the fact that your parcel was created prior to minimum parcel sizes has no bearing on that bundle of rights that you get in the zone. That's the best way I think I can explain it.
Yeah. As you know, my bias is to never be more restrictive than state restrictions, but of course there are other considerations here. And I think you and the planning commission have done a really good job. Especially with the hardship dwelling and potential change of use for that within a family or with a subsequent owner. And use the word awkward. There's awkward elements in state zoning law. That's a very kind word. But I appreciate you guiding applicants through these processes as seamlessly as possible. So I'm ready to make a motion if chair is.
Not quite yet.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so I don't have anything else to add. So I'm going to close this hearing and the record and consider whether we want to deliberate and decide today, or do we need to put this off for another day? Looking at staff. Any reason to
This
hold?
is a legislative process. You can take as much time as you need.
With that, I'll open for your motion.
Okay, but now that you've raised that, I'm a little concerned that nobody has come forward with any testimony.
The
So,
planning commission has.
yeah, that's what I was.
I mean, this is like, essentially for the most part, we're not creating anything new here. We're
Right.
just taking changes that have happened in state law that have accumulated over time. And we've been applying those statutes directly, and we are incorporating them into our code. And what we highlighted today are the changes that are discretionary, and there's only like 3 or 4 of them, right?
I know.
And so I'm not surprised that there wasn't a whole lot of, public participation in this because it's not, big and sexy.
In fact, it brings a little more clarity to some of these uses. Well, I'm satisfied with that. So I'll move to adopt the proposed text amendments in Polk County zoning ordinance chapters 136 and 177 as included in the attachments A and B in the staff report.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Further discussion?
Great job.
Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Hey.
Aye, passed unanimously. So, yeah, so do I need to read anything more with regard to the board's decision? Okay, thank you. All right, that concludes our public
We'll be
hearing.
back with an ordinance in 2 to 3 weeks.
All right, thank you. We have a need for an executive session.
Yes, sir. The board will meet in executive session pursuant to ORS 192-660 sub 2H to consult with counsel concerning the legal rights and duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation likely to be filed.